Please join me in welcoming Cardinal Wuerl.
Carter, thank you. Thank you for that very, very gracious welcome, a very gracious invitation, first of all, to be here. And I also want to thank Mary Rice Hassan. Thank you as well for the invitation to be a part of this wonderful and very, very significant gathering. In recognizing both of you, I also want to recognize three people who are making all of this possible, three benefactors. I want to recognize Mary Ellen Bork, Marjorie Campbell, and Luann Zurklo. The three of you are responsible in describing some of the impact or effect that follow on what we call the sexual revolution, and all of that impact that resulted from it, or at least finds a concomitant area of beginnings. I want to touch on what I would call the changes in the presuppositions or givens that were just a part of our moral, social, and cultural context. Here we find a shift in the value system that accepts and encourages the practices we see now so endemic and common today, that are really the result of overturning what were centuries-long givens. And these changes include three that I'm going to touch on. The first is the rapid and widespread acceptance of the secular view. The secular view as the horizon against which personal actions and public policy are evaluated. That horizon or level that allows one to go no further. The second is the diminishment or even the dismissal of church teaching as a norm for contextualizing activity, moral activity, and especially sexual activity, since we're talking about the results since the so-called sexual revolution. And then the third is the reevaluation of sexual activity itself. All three of these are realities out of which has come what we now face, what we live with, what we deal with today. The first element is what we so widely experience today and is so systematically advanced as the sole context for human experience, secularism. One concrete expression of the secularism and its manifestation today is found in a talk that Pope Benedict XVI gave to the bishops when he came to our country. And it wasn't that long ago, only 10 years ago, that he was here. And he spoke to us about experiencing and defining secularism as something we need to be alert to. He said that this perspective, this vision that excludes the transcendent, this perspective of reality is very different from the use of the word secular in contrast with clerical. This is a whole way of seeing life. There's a legitimate and proper divide between what we call church and state. Pope Francis, and before him, Pope Benedict XVI, referenced the positive role of the laity in contrast with clergy in the engagement of matters of public policy. But the secularism that both of them are talking about is a very different reality. Pope Benedict referred to secularism as that barrier, that conceptual barrier that is placed between our encounter with the living God as the source of our whole transcendent experience of life beyond simply the physical. He goes on to say, and this is a quote from his talk to the bishops when he was here, "While it is true that this country is marked by a genuine religious spirit, the subtle influence of secularism can nevertheless color the way people allow their faith to influence their behavior." And that's the force of secularism that is so at work in our world today. It has the power to silence any tendency, the Pope continues, to treat religion as a private rather than as something that is a part of the way we experience life. Political life, communal life, has to be resisted, he said. Only when their faith permeates every aspect of their lives do Christians become truly open to the transforming power of the gospel. If you begin by saying there is no transcendent reference point, then you're bound to be contained within the limits of what is ultimately quantifiable. And that's the difference, isn't it? Limiting to the quantifiable the whole reality of human experience. Manifestations of secularism are found, again, Pope Benedict tells us, in materialism, which can too easily focus our attention on the hundredfold, which God promises in this life, to the exclusion of life eternal, which is the whole purpose of this life. He then goes on to say, yet another manifestation of secularism is the individualism, an individualism that allows us easily to lose sight of our interdependence, the fact that we relate to one another, that we have obligations to one another, that there's a greater reality than just ourselves. When we speak about the impact of secularism, we have to recognize that its stepchild is the all-pervasive relativism. This is a relativism that allows us to dismiss anything of normative value for our lives, for our culture, for our society. It's so much a part of our culture today that I'm not certain we even recognize how powerful it is. The secularism that has become the frame of reference for the way conversations are carried out. A number of years ago, I was invited to speak at the Catholic Center at Harvard University. The title of the talk was "The Role of Faith in a Pluralistic Society." And when I was finished, there was a question and answer period. And the first hand that went up, the moderator was seated next to me, and he said, "Oh, he's from the law school." And he says he's an atheist. And I says, "Well, he has his hand up." So he went to the microphone and he said, "What do you people think you bring to our culture?" Now, the "you people" was not just me. In the front row of this great hall were some religious leaders, because this was an interfaith effort at explaining the role of faith in a pluralistic society. And so they were all there in their finery. I was in mine as well. So the "you people" was basically, what do you think religion brings to our society, coming out of that whole secular relativist world that would see what we're talking about as irrelevant to reality. But since he was a lawyer, and I had been told over and over again by learned lawyers, they all are, that a good lawyer never asks a question, the answer to which he doesn't already know. I thought, can I ask you a question before I try to answer yours? And he said, sure, go right ahead. And I said, what do you think this world would be like if it wasn't for we people? What if we didn't grow up hearing, you shall not kill, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not steal? What if we never heard growing up, do unto others as you would have them do to you? What if we never, as a society, as a culture, heard things like love one another, care for one another, blessed are the peacemakers? What would this society be like? And to his credit, he said, Father, it would be a mess. And it would. The second and significant change in presuppositions, in the givens that accompany the sexual revolution, is found in the beginning of the dismissal of papal magisterium as a point of reference for Catholic moral teaching. Under this second point falls the increasing acceptability within the Church of dissent from papal teaching. There's a significant point here because for Catholics in the past, up until this revolution, up until this sexual revolution, cultural revolution, so-called religious moral revolution, in the past, there was a constant, consistent, and accepted reference in matters of morality. And such assurance of a moral compass. It didn't mean that everybody followed it. It doesn't mean that before we had the revolution, everybody followed all of the commandments. But it does mean we knew they were there. We were able to identify them. And we knew there was a moral compass in life. Today, that's been greatly undermined as a result and beginning with the sexual revolution. We recognize that in every magisterial statement, not everything that could be said about a topic is said. But what we do know is that what is said is true. And that's part of the anchor that used to be the basis for our moral compass. And that has been greatly, greatly undermined, beginning with the social and cultural and sexual revolution. It's important to us to understand that what is said by the magisterium may not be everything that can be said about that topic, but what is said is true. And that's what gives us moral certitude as we try to live our lives. This is one of the great gifts. This is one of the great gifts of Jesus to his church, that we would have a compass. And that compass would always point in the right direction. I want to highlight this point because the impact of the gospel on culture, on society, on accepted human behavior is mediated through the church. If all of that wonderful reality that we talked about when my interlocutor at Harvard said, what do you people bring? All of that we bring only reaches into the fabric of culture through the mediation of the church in all of her spiritual, pastoral, educational, social service contacts with people everywhere. Isn't that how we first heard of it, learned of it? Isn't that why we have organizations like the Center for Ethics and Culture, like the Catholic Women's Forum, institutions that keep repeating and presenting and making available generation after generation after generation those basic fabric ties that hold us all together in our understanding of human values. Christ didn't leave us orphans. He turned over to his apostles, and through them, to the ongoing effort of his magisterial voice in the church, these significant formators and these markers along our moral path of how we're supposed to make our way. Theologians and scholars help the church to grow in a fuller understanding and appreciation of truth. But to be sure, they're not the official teachers, even though they're wonderful voices. What is passed on and how it's passed on is in that succession, that wonderful reality that is the apostolic succession. And to the extent that we diminish that, to the extent that we treat that voice as if it were not a normative voice in life, to that extent, we weaken the power of the moral compass to guide us. In its treatment on the role of the Pope, the Catechism of the Catholic Church always speaks of the Bishop of Rome in the context of the Episcopal College, but the Holy Father is always head of that college, with the emphasis that it's always with and never without Peter. Thus, when we turn our attention to the encyclical letter of Blessed, soon-to-be Saint Pope Paul VI, Humanae Vitae, we recognize that, like any encyclical, it manifests the teaching authority of the Roman Pontiff. And this becomes a guide, a part of that moral compass that is the fabric of Christianity in our culture. Moreover, we're very much aware that the acceptance is not always the case today. As a newly ordained priest, I was ordained and assigned to a parish in 1967, my first assignment. And the encyclical Humanae Vitae was published a year almost to the date of my arrival in the parish in 1968. It was immediately met with considerable dissent. This really began to mark what was going to be an acceptance of rejection or at least dissent from the voice of that moral compass that had guided us for so long and with such confidence in all of us as we accepted it. I now preside over this local church, but this church was the flashpoint for a lot of the dissent from that teaching. And I recall with some dismay those dissenters who announced that John the 23rd was their pope, not Paul VI. And I remember listening to a lecture on a campus, a Catholic campus, which will remain unnamed, in which the professor explained to us that the teaching of Paul VI was really his personal views, not to be confused with the solemn teaching of the church. And beginning in the 60s, beginning with the so-called sexual revolution, and connected deeply with it, was this increasing acceptability of dissent from papal magisterium. It might be helpful to look at just a few examples of that. I think there are some of us in this room who can go all the way back and remember Saint John the 23rd. Don't put up your hands because we don't have to give away our age. He had a wonderful encyclical, Mater et Magistra, mother and teacher. And there were those pundits who said, and it was considered very clever at the time, Mother, yes. Teacher, no. They didn't like the social content of that particular encyclical. Pope Paul VI, who followed John the 23rd, was criticized for misreading Catholic social teaching in his encyclical Populorum Progressio. And we can go on and on and on. Certainly they rejected Humanae Vitae. John Paul II didn't fare any better. There were many who thought that his encyclical Sollicitudine Socialis simply was not a correct presentation of social teaching. And his constitution, Mulieris Dignitatem, on the role of women, didn't exactly get standing ovation from every part of the church. And we could go on, but my point is that the easy rejection, the easy dismissal of the content of magisterial teaching is one of those effects that continues to haunt us today. Now, I'm getting time signals that I'm supposed to move much more quickly, and so I'm going to move to the second point, because we could read, if we wanted, pieces from Humanae Vitae. We could read, if we wanted, some of the material from what the bishops of the United States did in support of that document. When Humanae Vitae was criticized, the bishops of our country did a pastoral letter collectively, Human Life in Our Day. They produced it in a year. That in itself was almost a miracle. But the second point I want to touch on is, aside from this brushing aside of moral principles, there is a very strong element in our culture today that has redefined sexual activity. And the result is that we've lost the moral compass. We've allowed the secularism to replace, as a frame of reference, how we're going to evaluate these things. And what we have is what our Holy Father points out, Pope Francis, that, and as the Synod of 2014 and 2015 reported, that there is the desire to marry and form a family remains vibrant, especially among young people. And this has to be an inspiration for the church, but it is something we have to focus on and find ways to support. Returning to both the content of Humanae Vitae and the bishop's pastoral letter, Human Life in Our Day, we find the same words that we find in Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia. And that is, there's a common, accepted, or should be accepted reality and articulation of what is the natural moral order. Now, those are words we don't hear today. But all that says is that there's something prior to my judgment that offers a foundation for the moral judgment I'm about to make. This double aspect of marriage, both the sexual activity and reproductive nature, but also the communal, the sharing, the building up of a human relationship, all of that, the church says, is not something that is divinely revealed. It's something that one can come to from the natural moral order, from experiencing human life, from experiencing the way things are. But this is one of the losses of the secular hegemony. We used to be able quite clearly to define things in relation to their reality, an objective recognition. This is the way things are. I experienced the power of the new secularism here in our community when, a number of years ago, when the decision was made that the civil authorities were going to redefine marriage. They were going to redefine what constitutes marriage. And I had asked if we could have a breakfast meeting with some of the leading media people here, because I thought it would be good if I could hear from them what they were thinking, and I could try to share with them something of the thinking of the church. But in the discussion, it was very clear that the starting point was heavily relativist. The starting point was almost completely secular. There was this ceiling, and you weren't going to get beyond the ceiling by any transcendental reference, and you certainly weren't going to be able to break through the relativism by any appeal to an objective norm. So I thought I would do something clever. It didn't work, but I'll tell you anyway. There was a bowl of fruit, decorative, real fruit, but it was decorative, on the breakfast table. And so I said, do you mean to say that there isn't an objective reality out of which comes the need for a specific name? We pick the name, but it comes out of the specific difference. I said, for example, here's an apple, here's an orange. And do you mean to say that if the Congress of the United States announced that it's discriminatory to call this apple an apple when it should also be called an orange, that there's nothing to prevent that from happening? And here's where my clever little argument fell apart. They simply said, yes, there isn't. There isn't. That the power to do that that's a political decision. And if you have a majority, that becomes the new name. In what remains of the time left to me, and I don't want to go too far beyond it, what remains of that time, I want to just touch on an important element in the work of the church today. Granted, we live in this context that I've just described, and I don't think there's anybody here that would dispute that. We live in this heavily secular world in which the reference point does not include a transcendental point, and that we are very, very much convinced that the relativism is the reality, not objective, cognitively attained points of reference. What are our tasks then? Part of it is a healing process. If we're going to deal with what has happened as a result of all of that, we need to take the posture of healing. I mean, how desperate has our culture become for that healing as a result of the craziness that has flowed from the secularism? It wasn't that long ago here, I read in one of the major newspapers the defense for prostitution on the grounds that if sex is simply for personal satisfaction, then why can't part of the satisfaction be payment? And so, and my first reaction was, this is absurd. And then I read, this is an editorial. That we should simply accept that. And the church is now saying there are lots and lots of people caught up in that world of reference, of understanding. And what's our responsibility? Our responsibility is healing, the beginning of the process of somehow re-establishing that moral compass, point of reference. And we're not going to do that simply by repeating over and over and over again the same teaching, which remains true. But now we have a world that doesn't even understand those words. I had a conversation with a lovely, lovely group. These were young couples, young, faithful couples, and with children. And we were talking about marriage and the permanency of marriage. And one couple said when I challenged the ability of this generation to be as comfortable with commitment as an earlier generation. And one of the couples said to me, Cardinal, we believe in the permanency of marriage until it doesn't work. And no one in the room did what you and I just did, chuckled, because the language is altogether different. And our task, my brothers and sisters, our task in the accompaniment of this generation, in the accompaniment of people who have to be once again with us, our task is not only to have clear in our mind the teaching, but to be able to reach out to them in a way that they begin to try to hear us. There is an element of going out, there's an element of engaging, there's an element of trying to encounter, and there's an element of accompaniment. And this is where Pope Francis is calling us to the very best within us. We know the teaching, but if we're just going to repeat the teaching, how are we going to reach the people who don't understand what that teaching means? I remember during the synod, we had two synods, one in 2014, one in 2015, on family. The 2014 was on all the problems facing family life today. And they're everywhere. They're on every continent. When I mentioned secularism, I expected that the response was going to come from Europe and North America. It came from across the entire globe. But the second synod was on presenting the beauty of our teaching, the wonder of our revelation, and the experience of marriage. But then came the question, and this was, I think, at the heart of where we are today. What is needed is more than just repeating the same teaching. The teaching doesn't change. One of the cardinals put his hand up and when he was called upon to speak said, if we're just going to repeat it, if we're only here to repeat that teaching, why don't we just turn to the pages of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, tell them to reprint it, and we can go home. The challenge is to be able to once again engage the rest of the church's pastoral ministry. It's one thing to be able to teach, it's another thing to be able to help people understand and then make their own and then begin to live that teaching. And since the time card has already indicated I've gone over, I'm going to conclude with just this one final note, and that is where we began. We began by indicating the role of the Petrine Magisterium. I think we need, in this age, when we're dealing with how do we accompany, how do we actually go out, encounter, engage, accompany, help people to even begin to understand what we're talking about, because what we have to say is so wonderful and so beautiful and so powerful. But we have to help them begin to hear what we're saying. And that brings us to the role of Peter. You're Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. You and I, in all of our efforts to do some healing, in all of our efforts to address the second thoughts of the sexual revolution, we need to keep one hand on that rock. That way we know what we're saying, what we're teaching, how we're accompanying, and how we are reaching out is all faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to the teaching of his church. Pius, John Paul, Benedict, Francis, my brothers and sisters, they're all Peter. They're all Peter. And as long as you and I have our contact with, and we can stand firm on that rock, we know we are faithful to what the Lord Jesus asks of us. We, on our part, we can simply praise God and thank him for the gift of our faith, the reality of the church, and for the presence of Peter, the rock on which that church stands. Thank you.